Hey, my fellow ecologists. I hope you are all doing well. We covered population ecology, and now we're moving up the ranks here as far as hierarchies and disciplines. Whereas in population ecology, we considered the a single species in a geographic region. Now we're taking a geographic region, whatever you want it to be, and we are looking at all of the living things, all of the populations that inhabit that geographic area. And as a community ecologist, you have some other things to think about. We're not really interested in abundance so much, like how many of them are there, not so much. But we're interested in these, what we would say, these interactions. They may or may not interact with one another, but mostly they do, or there's sometimes there's a dependence that goes on, whether it's a food web or a food chain, somebody's eating this one, or whether you have this evolutionary relationships like mimicry or camouflage, those that have arisen because you have populations that have been living in that same geographic area for a very long period of time. Now, you see on the slide there is a spy sloth. That is shown in one of your learning activities. Just so you know, I think you've probably already seen it. It's very cool. If you haven't, you will in your learning activity. And now for the first part of our community ecology lecture, we're just going to talk about different aspects, like how you assess a community ecologist. How do they assess? What we have here for the most part is what's the structure? What's the assemblage? What are the dynamics of a community given the populations that live there? Now, a term that you may have heard, it's a big buzzword, even if you're not going to be an ecologist, is the term biodiversity. Diversity means a mixture of all different things. Bio, of course, is life or living things. And we say biodiversity is the key to our existence, life on Earth. We as humans could not live if we have an impoverished degree of biodiversity. We need lots of plants, we need lots of animals, lots of fungus, lots of living things to share our planet with in order to survive. We'll see that. We'll get more into that with ecosystem ecology. And a conservation ecologist's goal is to preserve biodiversity or restore biodiversity, which we will see in a few lectures from now. Now, biodiversity can be genetic. Biodiversity, that means there's a genetic level of biodiversity where you, for instance, it's a example is the bananas that we eat, the Cavendish bananas, the ones that we see mostly in our grocery stores. They're all clones of one another, and so have extremely poor genetic diversity. I mean, they're all basically the same. And so if you have, or this isn't hypothetical, but there is a fungus, Panama fungus, that has killed most of the Cavendish bananas in the Eastern Hemisphere, and it's moving west. They've confirmed that it has been documented here in the West. If you don't have genetic diversity, none of these banana plants have any immunity, since they're all the same, to this fungus. And so they're predicting in the next 10 or 20 years the Cavendish banana will no longer exist. If you plan on having kids one day, they may not know what a Cavendish banana is. But that's genetic diversity, and we don't cover that in this course. You can have a ecosystem level of biodiversity, like for instance, like a landscape biodiversity, like on any given, like if you've been up in an airplane, you see lots of different types of ecosystems. You have like woods, and you have fields, meadows, and streams, and lakes, and forests. that's biodiversity on an ecosystem level. We want all sorts of different types of ecosystems in any given geographic area. But what we concern ourselves with and how the term biodiversity is often used as default is on a community level. In any given region, you want lots and lots of different plants and animals and fungus. That actually is the parrot in the background. She's ready to scream. Hopefully she won't. She's kind of making that mewing sound. She's getting louder. Sorry. We want community biodiversity, lots of different plants and animals that live in any given area. And the term for this is species richness, specifically when we're talking about community level biodiversity. So you'll hear that being used. I may go back and forth with that. The term biodiversity, again, is most commonly used to mean species richness, you know, all the different plants and animals in any given geographic area. So you will hear that interchangeably, but species richness specifically is the biodiversity that occurs on a community level. So what are different ways of how communities are structured? Now, I should say the second part 2 of community ecology, are the different relationships like food webs and food chains and camouflage and mimicry. This first part is just these different types of structures and some of the ways that community ecologists assess the species richness of a geographic area. Rank, relative abundance, dominance, species, diversity indices. These are all ways of assessing structure and dynamics. Rank, simply order of species from the most abundant to the least abundant. So you look at a geographic area and the ones that are most of is ranked first. The ones that are least of is ranked last. You see how many different species are present and you go from 1 to 10 or what have you. Relative abundance is compared to everything else in the community, like the percentage of how many of those individuals make up the full proportion. And as you see here, like this is 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%. There's your relative abundance. Your dominance. This is in some communities, and mostly we see this in plant communities where this term is used, is where you would have predominant, if a single species, a population in that community predominates, we say that is the dominant species. And in a plant community, we would kind of use that to characterize that geographic area. Like with lots of wooded areas, we say it's a mixed oak forest because that's the dominant species, or a hemlock forest because that tree is the most in biomass that there is. Now you can use, and we will do this in lab, is you could actually assign an index, a number that will compare side by side, kind of apples to oranges in a way, of two different geographic areas to see which one is more biodiverse than another. You can compare two forests, but you can compare, like, which we should do in our lab, is compare like the biodiversity degree or index of a meadow versus a forest, which is more biodiverse. They're two different communities, but which is more biodiverse? And we use it's a Simpson's diversity index, but in lab we use the inverse Simpson's index, where the math isn't difficult, it's just tedious. We'll see that when we carry out the lab. And what it does is it takes into account how many different species are present versus how many individuals of each species are present. And you do all kinds of funky math, and it spits out a number, an index number, between 0, no, that was the other one. shoot, I can't remember off the top of my head. I've done this for like 40 years and I can't remember. My brain is melting here. But the higher the number, the index number after all the math is said and done, the more diverse that area is. So you can, in addition, the Shannon index is just different math. It deals with logarithms, which is why I don't use it as much. But your diversity index, your inverse Simpson's index, and your Shannon index, you do a lot of math, again, taking into consideration how many species, how many populations are present, and how many individuals are in those populations to give you a number that can then compare one geographic area to the next. Like that forest has an inverse Simpson's index of 3.8, whereas that meadow has an inverse Simpson's index of 1. And that tells you that the forest is more diverse than the meadow. You can also apply this to animals. For instance, the biodiversity of a bird community in a field or a meadow versus a forest. So that's one a tool that community ecologists will use, are these diversity indices. But you also have rank and relative abundance and dominance as well. The keystone species concept. This is very interesting. In any given community, you have a variety of plants and animals and fungus, and you have this balance. If you remove a given population or a population goes extinct, you may see a change in the assemblage of that particular, a small change, may or may not. But with a keystone species, what a keystone species is, it's a species or a population that its presence completely dictates the assemblage of the entire community. And if it is removed, that entire community assemblage collapses. It's the thing that keeps the whole community in check. Sea otters are a keystone species. I believe this week you are, for your activity, you're watching the favorite movie of most of the ecology students, Saving Otter 501, and it goes into sea otter, why sea otters are so important as far as why there's a huge effort to conserve them. And it's not just because they're so darn cute. They are responsible for maintaining the kelp forests off of Northern California. And kelp, as you see in the bottom picture, there you go, kelp is several meters high. You can see it. You can see there's the person, there's the kelp. Hundreds of square miles of these kelp forests, which boasts a biodiversity that's higher than most of our rainforests. Like you think of a rainforest as lots of birds and other animals and plants. Actually, this is more biodiverse, these kelp forests, than rainforests. With the near extinction of sea otters, they noticed that sea otters' favorite food here are these urchins, is the urchins then took over and munched down all of the kelp, and all of the fish and other animals that live in the kelp forests started falling one by one. And so they recognized that the sea otter is a keystone species, and why it is so important for efforts of conservation. You save one and you save them all. You save a sea otter and you save that entire kelp forest. So that's why there's so much effort that is put into place. We also referred to this as a trophic cascade. Trophic means feeding or to eat. And if you remove the sea otter, that is why you lose so much biodiversity, because it tumbles down the food web. These videos, you're going to be doing this series of videos, you'll be doing a class activity on that, so you can watch them if you want. Wolves is a keystone predator. You're also doing a learning activity about wolves this video, so you can save that for another time to watch it when you're actually doing the learning activity. As far as wolves' role as a keystone predator in Yellowstone National Park, and how their reintroduction changed the entire community assemblage of Yellowstone National Park. Not only that, but actually changed certain abiotic factors like the flow of the rivers. It's a really fascinating learning activity. Now you also have a concept as far as the way these communities are structured in the way of a time format. It's referred to as succession. And an ecological succession event, it's just that you have these communities that change over time. You see up here this aquatic community, depends on, the location of your pond or your lake. But inevitably, given time, whether it's 100 years or 10,000 years or 20,000 years, you do have some ponds that eventually fill in with silt. You have water plants that start to grow and secure the bottom mud. Then you wind up having emergent vegetation, which then gets covered over with solid soil and shrubs and trees until you have a forest or a bog. It's a different type of ecosystem that can occur as a result of aquatic succession. Now, in succession events and terrestrially, I'm going to try to make this bigger. You have primary succession events and you have secondary succession events. It's a little easier to see. In primary succession, what you wind up having is you have an area that is just completely blank of living things. This is a bare rock. And over periods of time, you wind up having this replacement of plant species as the conditions, abiotic conditions change, basically by the presence of those plant species. So we call the first ones to move in, like mosses, the pioneer species. And that presence of moss breaks the rock down. The moss dies and creates topsoil. This cools that area down. You then can have grasses that eventually are able to grow. And these pioneer species and these first plants that inhabit an area, moss is a plant too, they have to be able to live under conditions that are very hot and very dry, low in nutrients, and tolerate wind. But then the presence of the grasses, puts nutrients into the soil, cools the soil down, breaks the wind a bit, until you're able to have here like shrubs can grow because you have more nutrients, it's cooler, and the presence of the shrubs cools the soil down to the degree where you can then even have trees replace some of these species. Sometimes the original species can still live in that area, but generally you have an overturn with these types of succession events until you reach what's called a climax community or a climax forest. Now, in a secondary succession event, you have an established community already in place, but you have some sort of a disturbance that occurs within the community. I know in our woods we had, it wasn't a tornado, it was when they have those really quick horizontal winds that blew out some trees. And so now you have an area, this is obviously what's shown here is a fire. You have some area within that climax community that is now removed except for the soil. And you wind up then having plants that are typically very fast growing that are different from the climax community because they can tolerate sun, whereas in a climax community you have lots of plants that can only tolerate shady conditions until you wind up establishing that original community. So primary succession is where you have a bare area that eventually then winds up getting to the point of a forest. This can sometimes take 100 years or longer. Secondary succession is where you already have an existing climax community where you have a disturbance and that area then regrows. Now, as a community ecologist, you'd be really interested to see how all of this works, and especially when we talk about natural disasters or restoring communities, if let go, um, to let what we would say nature take its course as far as what would replace, what would grow after such events. Now, in population ecology, we talked about intraspecific competition, and now we talk about interspecific competition in any given community. Now we are at talking about different relationships within a given community, not just how communities are structured. So where you have competition occur that's interspecific is where you have, it's the same thing as intraspecific. It's competition over a resource, whether it's similar habitat requirements or food sources, but they're amongst two different species. Like for instance, it look like starlings and this mammal looking thing. It looks like they're both competing over some sort of a food source, and so are these lions with the vultures. They're competing, and probably, I'm sure there are hyenas in there. The picture's kind of small, competing over this zebra, this dead zebra. Now, in interspecific competition as well as intraspecific competition, we say that it's harmful to both species. That's a negative and a negative. And when we think of competitions, we think that there's a victor, somebody wins and somebody loses. So why don't we have a plus for the winner and a minus for the loser? Actually, competition of any sort expends all sorts of energy from both parties. And when you engage in competition, you are using this energy in order to do so. And even if you wind up being like what seems to be the winner, you still are losing out because you have expended so much energy, more so than if you did not engage in competition whatsoever, which is why we have the two negatives. You'll see these symbols here as far as plus, minus, or neutral. What we have when we look into intraspecific competition, two concepts here. The competitive exclusion principle is the first one we'll discuss. This is where the phenomenon when you have those particular species, different species, which have very similar habitat needs in the same geographic area, will compete with one another. And in competitive exclusion, you wind up having one that outcompetes the other, oftentimes to the extirpation or extinction of the other one. An example here, we see this a lot with introduced or invasive or non-native species. These wonderful little quiet bluebirds were as common as robins, 60, 70 years ago. And unfortunately, with their introduction from Europe of a starling, who is also a cavity nester, lives in hollow trees, but they're much more aggressive than bluebirds. And so they kind of bred like wildfire. They didn't have any natural enemies when they were introduced here into the United States. So they took over. They kicked all these little bluebirds out of their nesting areas, and bluebird populations almost went extinct in our area until we had a big push as far as reestablishing habitat needs for bluebirds. Nest boxes, actually. You see all these nest boxes that are built, like the Boy Scouts did, I think, the first wave of them back in the 70s. And a lot of conservation groups also have nest boxes. So the bluebirds have a place to nest and reestablish their populations. And they have since bounced back. They're not as common as robins, not as common as they used to be, but they have bounced back. And if you ever have built one, you make the hole a certain size so the starlings can't fit in, because they are a little bit bigger than bluebirds, so they can't fit in. Now, where you wind up having, or I should say some terms that are used here, is in the face of no competition, you have what's called a fundamental niche. Now, habitat is the general location of an animal, where it lives, like the woods or a stream or a lake. A niche or a niche is the specific needs within that habitat as far as what that animal, or I should say, or plant specifically uses. When there's no competition, we say that the area where it can live is the fundamental niche. Let's see if we can make this picture bigger. Yeah, we can. So, for instance, the fundamental niche in brown here of the Chalmus is this entire area of rocky shoreline. And it would live there if it weren't for, that's its fundamental niche. It would live there if it weren't for the balanus in blue here. It's a different type of barnacle. And they compete with one another, believe it or not. And so you wind up having the Chalmus, because there's competition with the balanus, have a realized niche, what we call the realized niche, where the animal actually, or plant, exists in the presence of competition. So your fundamental niche is when there's no competition, but the realized niche is where it actually lives due to that competitive pressure. And then you have some interactions as far as interactions in a given community. One is called resource partitioning, another one I should say. And you can have what's called niche overlap, where you don't have organisms that are sparring, or individuals of different species. They're not sparring over a resource. They're just, you know, they're using the same resource, but there's no competition. But you do have this really cool phenomenon as a result of evolutionary pressures where, and I know this is anthropomorphizing it, making it seem human, but you wind up having animals and plants where they utilize a similar resource, but they wind up dividing it or divvying it up. And they're not constantly fighting each other over the privilege to use that resource. For instance, warbler foraging zones. These can also reflect their nesting areas. All of these different types of warblers use this same type of tree, the same species of tree. And it would take a lot of energy and a lot of time if every season they would just fight over this tree for the privilege of using the resource here. But they've evolved a sort of a truce, you know. They came to the table and said, all right, you can have this part of the tree and I'll have this part of the tree and I'll have this part of the tree. The Cape May warbler, I'm going to stay here. Blackburnian stays a little further down. Same with the black-throated green warbler. The bay-breasted warbler is going to stay more towards the middle here of the tree, and the murder warbler is going to stay down towards the bottom. And they don't fight over it. They just share it. Not what you see in nature films, but a fascinating result of community interactions and dynamics, nonetheless. That is resource partitioning. So in our first lecture here, just went over some different concepts as far as what a community is and the concept of biodiversity and species richness, rank, relative abundance, dominance, and different species diversity indices, a keystone concept, the idea of succession in the ecological community, primary and secondary, some interspecific ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, the competitive exclusion principle, and the resource partitioning theory. Okay, that's it. Onwards to next week, you're going to learn about different types of evolutionary relationships and feeding relationships, but we'll leave it at that for this week. Hope you're all well, and take care and goodbye.